Hi, Bill. Thanks so much for joining me today and discussing the sustainability topic with me. It's a series we're doing with Boyden and really excited to get your input on it as well. So I guess just first of all, Bill, what are the game-changing shifts and opportunities that are arising across renewable energy within aerospace?
Yeah, well, sure. Firstly, Aaron, thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. So, from my perspective, there's a series of shifts that are taking place in our industry around renewables and decarbonization, and I wouldn't describe them all as game changing. You and many of your viewers would probably be aware that there's a lot of excitement around hydrogen and hydrogen propulsion as potentially a game changer in aviation. We see that in Boeing as a much longer term prospect. It's something we all have to invest in and study, but some of the things that are really taking place now that are shifting our industry are in sustainable aviation fuels. And for the first time, we're really seeing widespread evidence for scale up of sustainable aviation fuels. And that is fuel that is made from non-fossil sources is also meeting all of the right independent sustainability criteria. And so that's number one. And I'll kind of talk about that again in a moment. The other thing that is really exciting is more electrification in our industry. It's ground infrastructure where you see hybrid electric vehicles at airports and in logistics and moving cargo, but more electric architectures in our airplanes. The 787, for example, which has now been flying for a decade, has a number of systems that were originally hydraulic that are now performed by electric systems. And that really contributes to sustainability and to decarbonization because it makes the airplane more fuel efficient. And when you have a product that is going to be in service for 60 or 80 years, it's all about the fuel and fuel efficiency and doing the mission of travel with fuel that is sustainable and doesn't contribute to the entire life cycle emissions of the airplane. So they're probably the two things. The other thing that I think is an opportunity is we're really seeing regional partnerships emerge. I mean, I'm really observing regional feedstock and logistics and processing opportunities emerge in aviation biofuels. I see that in Europe. You see that in numerous places in North America and across the Asia Pacific region, and even in the Middle East. I'm on the board of a consortia called the Sustainable Biofuels Research Center, and we produce fuel from saltwater tolerant vegetation that in turn is fertilized from aquaculture. And you've got this completely closed loop system that is just perfect for desert ecosystems and coastal zone ecosystems where you're worried about water availability, you're worried about land, and you're worried also about waste. Aquaculture is one of those industries that as it scales up is also contributing to pollution to coastal zones. And so here's a system where you actually take the waste and use it to grow biofuels. So those kind of regional opportunities, we see them in lots of locations around the globe. The other opportunity is this public-private sector partnerships that are emerging. The UAE example that I gave is one of them, but industry and government working together to help enable renewables in aerospace, like biofuels, helping small startups invest in hybrid electric architectures that will eventually lead to personal mobility. And then from there, as battery technology scales up, larger and larger aircraft that can transport people further. That's a journey. That is going to be a journey. It's going to take a long time for all the technology to come together in the right regulatory framework, just like hydrogen that I mentioned earlier. But it's definitely an opportunity.
Absolutely. It's such an exciting time at the moment in the industry as well. I think we're really seeing a push for a lot of changes and development in that space. But I guess from your perspective, looking at the current environment, have you observed any key pivots that are kind of against or enabling the development of widespread use of renewable energy?
Yeah. So thanks for the question. So in that current environment, I'm noticing a number of pivots and a number of changes that are acting to both make aviation focus more on sustainability. We always have been focused on sustainability. When you think about it, fuel efficiency and each new model that we produce, whether it's Boeing, Airbus, Embraer, or another OEM, is expected to bring a product to the market that's even more fuel efficient than the previous one, the model that it replaces. And but what I am observing is what is changing now, and a couple of things. The first thing is you're really seeing renewables at scale in other industries. So the stationary energy generation, wind, solar, is really at scale, right? And you're also seeing starting at scale electrification of ground transport. Cars, lorries, even rail in some cases, and now even some discussion around LNG and sort of lower carbon emission ways of enabling enabling the marine transport industry. So that's a pivot in the sense that now the industry is taking notice, like consumers are taking notice. Aviation doesn't really contribute a lot to global CO2 emissions, but when you have other industries that are really now starting to operate at scale, then that's a critical signal. It's a pivot for our industry that we need to also be thinking about the next generation of technologies. We need to be thinking about enabling critical value chains that are going to enable aviation biofuels, like I mentioned, or investments that are going to continue with this journey of hybrid electric and more electrification of our industry. So that's kind of the one thing that I've noticed in the current environment. The other thing I think we've probably all started to feel as individuals and as consumers is that around the world, many of us are starting to take notice of climate change. COVID actually accelerated that trend, and it's allowed a kind of a space for this sentiment, has allowed more space for investments to occur. It's given the confidence, I think, in the industry, the greater confidence that creating new value chains focused on things like electrification, sustainable aviation fuels, personal mobility, and even hydrogen, are things that we need to accelerate. One great example of that is a couple of weeks ago, Boeing, Sky Energy, which is a US and European-based company, and Alaska Airlines here in the Pacific Northwest of North America, and some other partners, we announced that we were partnering together to enable the production of sustainable aviation fuels in the Pacific Northwest at scale and distribution, including making it available to our delivery centers. I mean, we'd had that as something that we were doing previously, but now we're really doing it with all of the market confidence and at scale. So, there's some kind of critical things that are happening at the moment that are really enabling wider scale use. What's acting against that at the moment is really not a whole lot, which is this is kind of the moment, and this is the time. I think one of the things that we really have to pay attention to is getting the right policy frameworks in place. So if there's anything that I think is potentially acting against, the industrialization of renewables in aerospace, is we've got to make sure that around the globe that the right incentives, the right policy frameworks are all in place to really help enable these critical value chains and coalitions to come together. That's the thing that I think we pay most attention to. There's some technical things that we need to solve for, but I believe we know the pathway, we know the roadmap. Just one example of that is we made an announcement as the Boeing announcement that by 2030, all of our product line in commercial aviation would be able to fly on 100% biofuels. Today, we have regulatory approval and we have standards around a 50% blend for sustainable aviation fuels. There are some technical challenges that we need to solve to get to 100% around the airplane. It's things like the fuel systems and the seals that are in fuel systems. So those things will happen. What you want to have is the technical roadmap progressing in concert with the roadmap around how to enable the market. And when you're trying to develop, just like in stationary energy, when you're trying to develop a whole new value chain, it takes a lot of stakeholders and a multi-stakeholder viewpoint to come together, including NGOs, including scientists, including various elements in the supply chain. We all have to come together. If you think about it, the petroleum industry has well over 100 years of building out its value chain. We're trying to build something in a really short space of time.
Excellent. You've touched on it throughout that part. You mentioned obviously the importance of consumers' perspectives on what is happening. And then on top of consumer values being important, you've also got really an evolving regulatory environment. How is Boeing, on top of what you've sort of mentioned already, how is Boeing really responding to those evolving environments?
Yeah, that is a really great question. Like, what are we as an industry, what are we as a company doing around some of these, this evolving interest in ESG and corporate social responsibility? Well, the first thing that we've done is we now have a Chief Sustainability Officer in Chris Raymond. And what that organization does is it really provides a focus for all of the myriad of activities that we're doing. And whether it's the technical ones that I just talked about, or whether it's engagement with STEM and with NGOs in looking at agricultural or social development projects around the globe. All of those things matter, but they're so much more powerful when you can bring them together. So that's one of the first things we're doing is putting a focus around what are a series of both existing and new initiatives. That's important because firstly, it helps our employees just understand the myriad of things that we do and how they can get involved. And we've got no shortage of ideas in our company and no shortage of people who really want to make the world a better place. And by providing that focus, we provide an outlet. We provide a way of reinforcing what people want to do in their own lives and bring it to work. So that's the really exciting thing about it. The other thing is it's an external facing way of showing the world that we care and that we want them to partner with us. And the other thing that we want to do, and this is, you talk about the evolving regulatory environment, is for at least 20 plus years, and I'm trying to think, it's until from at least the early 90s, we've had a guidepost with what's called the what was called the Millennium Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals that first came from what was the Brundtland Report and then were adopted by the UN. And so these guideposts, these ways of acting, behaving, is really, and holding yourself accountable is really what we're also doing in this evolving regime of very much interest in ESG and CSR, and that is adopt those sustainable development goals, because everybody can see, both inside the company, outside the company, and with all of our stakeholders, that we are working against some really well-recognized, well-respected, and credentialed ways of acting and holding yourself accountable. So I think that's how we're doing it, and I know other industries, other companies in our industry are thinking about this the same way.
It's kind of one of the things at the moment. We're talking a lot about the regulatory changes and consumer values changing. If we then look deeper into, let's say, behavioral aspects, what are the kind of behaviors and most important behaviors that organizations and consumers will need to implement to really have an impact?
Really great question. So the most important behavioral change for an organization or for an individual that you need to adopt is if I go back to the comment that I made a little earlier about ESG and CSR and the evolving regulatory framework, is not think of that as a regulatory framework per se, but as a mindset that you need to adopt. And just like when I talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, about water and causing little harm and being socially responsible and looking after and being part of community, like looking after community, and it's this triple bottom line sustainability that is embedded in this regulatory framework is see it as a mindset to adopt. And I think that's the most important thing. I think first in behavior is to recognize that the importance of ESG, and then ask yourself, well, what can I do? Think about doing more with less. How can I go about my day just doing more with less, and waste nothing? And think. And so if I think back to like Sustainable Development Goals, what are they really? It's about meeting your needs today and the needs of your family and your community, but ensuring that you do so in a way where you don't sacrifice the future. You meet the needs of future generations, your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. And if you can go adopt that mindset, those behaviors just become habits, and you're meeting those regulatory, that you're living and existing in that regulatory framework in a way that is just how you are. And I think that's just so important.
Absolutely. Well, Bill, I really appreciate your insights on this topic. It's so timely at the moment, and it's really excellent getting your perspective, particularly as well being a part of Boeing and having that insight into what some of the key organizations in the industry are doing. So I love the passion for it and really intriguing insights. So thank you for sharing.
No, thank you, Aaron, for inviting me to this conversation. I really appreciate it.